The reading is from the beginning of Exodus 7 through verse 7. Hear the word of the Lord. The Lord said to Moses, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and I will multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. When Pharaoh does not listen to you, I will lay my hand upon Egypt and bring my people, the Israelites, company by company out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out from among them." Moses and Aaron did so. They did just as the Lord commanded them. Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. Word of the Lord. I'd like to read that passage again to you. One, because it's good to hear it twice, and two, because it's in my manuscript. And I wasn't anticipating a reading beforehand. But also, I think that it's good to hear because, and I chose it because it's kind of a foreshadowing, if not a little clumsy of one. And so let's read it again. The Lord said to Moses, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and I will multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. When Pharaoh does not listen to you, I will lay my hand upon Egypt and bring my people, the Israelites, company by company out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out from among them." Moses and Aaron did so. They did just as the Lord commanded them. Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. And I think that the rest of Exodus 7 through 9 follows that pattern, right? And before your academic minds start going and the wheels start turning and you start to wonder whether or not that's true and how closely it does follow that foreshadowing, just go with me here for a second. Moses is the quiet strength emanating power to the tune of Aaron's prophecy. Pharaoh is refusing time and time again to let the Israelites go. He's tricking them. He's changing his mind. And God's signs and wonders are wreaking havoc through the physical, but also the symbolic universe of the Egyptians. And by the way, Moses and Aaron were really old when this happened. Good to know. Think of the prologue, though, that we just read as like the front matter of a record or a CD, that it tells us the songs that we're going to hear and how long they are and in what order that we'll hear them. And the remainder of the text as the songs themselves played out for us to hear, so that we can think of this text 7 through 9 as the music of God's justice and deliverance for his people. See, the text, it paints a picture of God the iconoclast who is dancing in Egypt, unbound by any god or any power or any force that the Egyptians thought was stable and true and firm. See, this is not necessarily God's forceful takeover. This is not God's necessarily even wrath. This is God's mockery of Egypt, mockery of the powers that they thought were so secure. So it's a dance. And he's moving along and placing his feet wherever he thinks are good and true and beautiful and fitting. And he's moving, and nobody can really stop him. After centuries of silence, God's energies come out through the presence of two simple people. They are seemingly innocuous to the status quo, but once God's will comes out through Aaron's mouth, it becomes this force that is unstoppable and irresistible. It comes in quiet and then creates this big uproar as God dances through Egypt. He is avenging the oppressed, not by a demonstration of anger and power, but by a demonstration of the mockery of the power of the oppressors. We are to understand that God's choice of plagues were not accidental, right? That the locusts and the frogs and the Nile itself were representative of certain sacred features of the Egyptian world, and the gods who governed these elements themselves were helpless in the face of God's will. But more than that, it was God's will that the sacred institutions of the powerful here were turned on their head and used against them. It's as if the gods who controlled the frogs and the locusts and all of those kinds of things, who were supposed to use those in a way to create order and plentiful supply, were now being forced against their will to use them against the Egyptians for whom they were supposed to care. Again, it is a mockery, a dance of God amongst the Egyptian world. God's absolute freedom here is exerted and made known, that God is not bound by their gods. He is free to do as he wishes. He dances through Egypt, expressing his justice not in wrath, but in irresistibility. I don't think that it's sovereignty here. I think that it's freedom. It's the demonstration that nobody, no Egyptian god, no Egyptian institution, not even Pharaoh himself as a god, has the power to resist God's own freedom. The question that we ask ourselves in this text is the same question we ask ourselves in any text. Who are we? Where do we see ourselves? Are we the Pharaoh character, this sovereign in his own world, but who is the dog that returns to his own vomit time and time again? I've been waiting a long time to actually get to use that proverb in a homily, so this is a good moment for me. He really is a sympathetic character, though. He's the fool in the text from the perspective of the omnipotent reader, right? We see that, but in our own lives we lack that omnipotent perspective, and we resemble him so much, I think. We learn to rely on the sovereignty of our own judgment, on trust in the rationality of the kinds of decisions that we make, but we're also undone by that same sense of self-sufficiency. We create the world in our own image, but God isn't interested in that image by itself. Or are we like Moses and Aaron, who are delegates of the oppressed, and they're speaking on behalf of a power that they don't really grasp here? See, on the one hand, I think, like in Pharaoh's world, God cannot be moved or manipulated, and he's going at some level to overturn and become an iconoclast in our own world. He's going to make the things we thought were certain and sacred into things that are not in tune with his song. But at the same time, like Moses and Aaron, I think there is in some way that we can be in tune with that song, that we have to find a way to dance the way that God is dancing. Undeniably here, the side that God is on is the side of the people who he claims as his own, people who are characterized in a large respect by a kind of apparent sense of weakness. You have Abraham, the exile, and Israel, the slaves, and these are the people, Moses, who can't speak, and Aaron, who speaks about things that he doesn't understand. Two people against an entire established civilization. God is clearly interested in claiming the side of the weak here. It's in that sense that I think that the text speaks powerfully into our world, that God's absolute freedom becomes expressed in our world through, again, this idea of an iconoclasm, the overturning of oppressive forms of convention for the sake of the people who God claims as his own. It's certainly not a critique of power itself, but rather a reimagining what power has to be in our lives in light of God's own freedom. I wonder what that power can be in our lives and in our cultures and especially in our churches. And we're left with the task of discernment in light of that kind of power. What would it look like in my life to be in tune with that kind of power? A power I can't control, a power that is against me in some respects, but also a power that also claims me as his own? What would that look like in my life and in my public worlds and in the mission of our churches if we embraced the fact that God is dancing in a way that in some ways I can't control? That's our task of discernment. So I'll leave it there. And I'll leave us ourselves with a picture of that dance that comes from Acts. Hear the word of the Lord. In the last days it will be, God declares, that I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh. And your sons and your daughters will prophesy, and your young men will see visions, your old men will dream dreams. Even upon my slaves, both men and women, in those days I will pour out my Spirit, and they will prophesy. And I will show portents in the heaven above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and smoky mist. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the Lord's great and glorious day. Then everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. The word of the Lord. Thanks.